Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. My name is Morad Gorban. I'm the Director of Government Affairs for the Public Affairs Alliance of Iranian Americans. PAAIA is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, non-religious organization representing the interests of the Iranian American community in front of policymakers and the general public at large. Our work includes matters related to education, security, and immigration. We encourage greater civic participation of the Iranian American community, including programs directed at the youth to empower them to get involved in the American political process. We also foster greater understanding of Iranian culture and support the democratic aspirations of the Iranian people. Through our annual scientific surveys, PAAIA provides accurate information about the Iranian American community, their views and attitudes towards major policy issues. I would like to welcome you to our panel and briefing on the one-year anniversary of the Women Life Freedom Movement in Iran, and thank our congressional co-hosts, Congressman Jim Himes and Brian Fitzpatrick. The Women Life Freedom Movement has had a profound impact on the Iranian American community. Our 2023 polling results showed that the level of engagement for the Iranian American community is at an all-time high when it comes to U.S. Iran relations. Overwhelming majority of Iranian Americans want the U.S. government to support the protesters in Iran and consider the promotion of human rights and democracy as the number one priority when it comes to U.S. Iran relations. Today, our panelists will discuss the impact of the Women Life Freedom Movement throughout the past year and debate its challenges and successes. But before we get started, I wanted to welcome Congressman Jim Himes for joining us today and to say a few words about what's happening in Iran and what Congress is working on. Congressman Himes represents Connecticut's 4th District in the U.S. House of Representatives, where he is serving his 8th term. He is the ranking member of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence and on the House Financial Services Committee. Please join me in welcoming Congressman Himes.
Well, thank you, Murad, and you're going to hear from some spectacular subject matter experts here, so I'm going to keep my remarks very brief, but really I just wanted to be here to thank you both for celebrating and memorializing the life of Mahsa Amini, and in particular the movement that grew up around her brutal killing a year ago. It's something that we are partners with you on. Last week, in almost unanimous fashion, the House of Representatives passed the Mahsa Amini Act, and in ways large and small, the U.S. government, as I'm sure you are aware, is working in support of that movement. Iran is a very complicated place. We obviously have concerns about human rights, intense concerns about human rights, and have for a very long time. We also have concerns about the development of nuclear weapons, about the propagation of terrorism in the region. I could go on and on and on, but it is a remarkably complicated policy challenge, simplified, frankly, by, and I don't say this about many things, about the very clear position of right that the rest of the world assumes when it opposes the brutal behavior of this regime. It's something I've had very personal experience with for 6 years now, culminating just this week, because Murad Tabaz, a name that I'm sure is familiar to you, is one of my constituents, and Murad Tabaz turned 68 on October 1st, and of course has been unjustly held for almost 6 years in Evin prison, along with 4 or 5 other Americans and dual nationals. The deal to release him was as controversial as these deals always are, whether they're undertaken by former President Trump or going back to Bill Clinton. These things are always extraordinarily difficult because of the brutality of this regime. And of course, in a perfect world, you wouldn't need to engage a regime like this in ways that achieve your other policy ends. But I can tell you, as Murad Tabaz's representative, that I have a fairly unique understanding of the pain that is inflicted on the diaspora, on the families whose members are targeted, either in the demonstrations that are occurring to this day in Iran or through the hostage taking, et cetera. And I want to say, again, as I started, thank you. Thank you for keeping this torch alive, and know that you have a strong bipartisan consensus, if not unanimity, in the capital of the United States, that we will see this fight through to get to a point where Iran assumes its rightful place in the constellation of civilized nations. We have a long way to go to get there, but we will not pause in our efforts to make that so. So thank you for all the good work that you're doing in that regard, and I hope you have a wonderful day discussing these issues.
Okay, so next I would like to introduce our moderator for today, PAAIA's own Executive Director, Dr. Neda Baluchi. Neda is both a subject matter expert on the Middle East and a functional expert on governance, rule of law, elections, and human rights. Before joining PAAIA, she held the position of Associate Director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Rutgers University, which she joined after earning her PhD at Columbia University. Her opinions and writings have been featured in a variety of publications. NGOs, corporations, and governments have asked her advice on diverse topics within her specialization. Recently, she served on a legal team for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe's Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights. Neda, stage is yours.
Thank you, Murad. Hello, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's panel and welcome you, congressional members and staffers and our wider audience. I am so pleased at our esteemed panelists who have joined us today. They are at the forefront of being, they are subject matter experts in DC. They give testimony all around the country and internationally, and I really think that they are unparalleled in their knowledge of what they're going to be talking about today. I'm going to start with my most immediate right, Dr. Suzanne Maloney. She is the Vice President and Director of the Foreign Policy Programs at the Brookings Institution, where her research focuses on Iran and Persian Gulf energy. And prior to being named Vice President and Director, she served as the Deputy Director of Foreign Policy for 5 years. At Brookings, she is a leading voice, and I would also say not just at Brookings, but in DC, she is a leading voice on U.S. policy towards Iran and the broader Middle East, testifying before Congress, briefing policymakers, and engaging with government, nonprofit organizations like PAAIA and corporations. She is, of course, a frequent commentator in national and international media. It is really my pleasure to share a panel with Dr. Maloney again. Next to her is Dr. Henry Rome. He is a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, specializing again in Iran. We have brought you really specialists. He works and focuses on sanctions, economic, and nuclear issues. He was previously the deputy head of research and director covering global macro politics at the Eurasia Group, a leading political risk consultancy. He has also worked at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs and the Jerusalem Post, where he covered the Iran nuclear talks as the newspaper's only Persian-speaking journalist. Dr. Rome has written on U.S. Iran relations extensively, and of course, its economy and nuclear diplomacy. And finally, but not least of all, is Jasmine Ramsey, who is the Deputy Director of the Center for Human Rights in Iran. Drawing from her experience in journalism, communications, and Iranian contemporary politics, she creates and manages an international advocacy campaigns, documents the extensive and numerous human rights violations that occur in Iran, advocates for women's and human rights programs through media interviews as well as public speaking engagements. And she manages the center's English language content and social media channels. She previously worked as a journalist and the Deputy Bureau Chief of Interpress, an international news wire service. Again, I'm so happy that you are all able to make it. And I have to tell you, if you don't know me, we're going to really just dive into the issues. And we're going to move sort of more geographically and by subject matter. So we're going to start at the other end to talk about internal domestic Iran human rights issues. Then we're going to come to Henry and talk about regional politics and his specialty. And then we're going to come a little bit larger and do more international issues with Suzanne, and we'll go in that order again. So my first question, which will be a macro question with some sub-questions in there, is for Jasmine, of course. In February, the Supreme Leader's Office announced an amnesty for prisoners who had been arrested in relation to the Woman Life Freedom Movement. Last week, the Washington Post published an article providing some details about those arrestees and their life after being arrested. What are your comments in response to the Washington Post article, the state of those arrested in relation to these protests, their lives now, and civil rights in Iran in the course of the last year? 4 questions for Jasmine.
Sure.
Thank you.
So thank you, everyone, for being here and your interest in this topic. It's been 1 year since Iranians rose up and faced bullets, executions, arbitrary imprisonment to raise their voice against the state. 2 calls came out of that movement: woman life freedom, death to the dictator. The Supreme Leader's comments about amnesty are a PR ploy. There's a revolving door inside Iran for political prisoners. Hostage taking is the MO of this regime. It is not just foreign nationals that are taken and replaced with other ones. It's political prisoners, their family members. Currently, the father of a young man who was hanged in Iran around this time last year is in the same prison that his son was hanged in. What was his crime? Trying to hold memorials at his son's grave, asking for justice for his family. Families all around Iran continue to be harassed, intimidated, arrested, their homes raided. 2 journalists who simply reported facts about the killing of Mahsa Amini, 22 years old, last year, 3 days after she was arrested for her hijab, remain in prison 12 months after. One of them tweeted a photo of Mahsa's parents embracing in the hall of the hospital where she died. That's the state in Iran. There is no freedom of press. There is no free speech. Anything that is deemed critical of the government is criminalized and can be prosecuted. And of course, you face beatings and violence. At the same time, Iran is a country of resilient, beautiful people, a culture that goes on for thousands of years, beautiful geography. And it's very important to spotlight what's happening to the people under a government that grabs international headlines by talking about amnesties without mentioning, by the way, that many of the civil society leaders that were arrested and then released have been now put back in prison, and many of them remain in prison. Iranian women are really holding the line here on the woman life freedom movement. They're using their bodies to voice their dissent by walking in the streets of Iran without the forced hijab. Our organization is clear that the hijab should be a choice, not a tool of political repression, as the Iranian government has made it. It's made it the subjugation of Iranian women one of the pillars of its ideology. Iranian women are treated as second-class citizens. So it's truly amazing the level of courage that we see from women and young people like yourselves who would face imprisonment, beatings in the streets for doing what you're doing right now, trying to advance policies in your government that may not stand with the current administration. Sorry, I kind of went on there.
No.
Did I answer your questions?
I think you have
Okay.
answered our questions very clearly. Thank you so much. And so there has been mention, Henry, of the hostage deal, and I will actually come back and ask you about that as a heads up. But before we do that, I'd like to focus in a little bit more on the regional aspect and the deals that Iran has been making regionally, and specifically the Saudi-Iran rapprochement, and why you think it occurred, generally, your thoughts on that. And then some of the sub-questions are, do you agree that from Tehran's point, this is part of a larger strategy to encourage hedging against the United States by casting doubt on Washington's capability to serve as an effective external balancer and security grantor? 3, besides the involvement of China, why would Saudi Arabia agree after so many years of hostility to a deal? 4, what does this say about Saudi Arabia internally, if anything, as well as its position in the Persian Gulf and more broadly the Middle East? And finally, what significant steps or actions have you seen come out of this agreement?
Sure. Thanks very much. I will. Is this on? Yes, it is. Excellent. I will do my best to go through, and you all can be the judge if I get all 5 answers in. Thanks to PAAIA, Neda, and it's a pleasure to be here with Suzanne and Jasmine today. I'm also not a doctor, but if it's maybe in Iranian fashion, if it's repeated enough and shows up in Tasneem news, then I can assume that it's a fairly niche joke, but thank you for a few people laughing. So I think on the Saudi-Iran deal, so I think there are, just to give a brief context setting, so back in March, it was a surprise announcement in Beijing that Saudi and Iran had normalized, or were starting a process of normalizing diplomatic relations. These are two countries that had not had ambassadors or had embassies open for about 7 years, and so this was a kind of was seen as a bit of a geopolitical earthquake at the time. So I think from there are a lot of things went into this happening when it did. I think from the Saudi point of view, there was a clear kind of motivation to try to focus domestically on their economic transformation programs and to try to close off areas of conflict where they could, and also to try something else with Iran and see if they can make some progress in lowering tensions. I think there was an acute concern about the threat that Iran-backed forces in Yemen pose to the Saudi kingdom and to Saudi's kind of effort to frame itself as both a regional and a global economic and political player. And this was the Houthi threat had a potential to, and still has potential to, disrupt that. I think from the Iranian side, again, a number of different motivations. I think part of it is economic, in an effort to try to see if there are ties that can be built economically with Saudi Arabia to try to blunt the effects of U.S. sanctions. Part of it was to try to, I think, reduce the risk of, if there was to be a large and slash when there will be a kind of reprisal of the protests last year, to try to ensure, or at least help to ensure, that Saudi Arabia won't, in their view, intervene in support of the protesters. The Iranians were quite concerned, to the point of reportedly preparing to attack Saudi Arabia over the Saudi citizens' funding of Iran International and other television outlets. So I think that was a clear kind of push from the Iranians. There are a few other kind of motivations that get into it, but I think practically speaking, what ended up happening, I mean, the deal itself is quite modest. This is not a kind of a major détente or rapprochement between the two sides. It was, strictly speaking, a normalization of diplomatic ties. So they've swapped ambassadors, they've reopened embassies, and so far the Saudis have said publicly they do not see any major weapons shipments from Iran to their Houthi allies. I think that the way they phrased that is quite particular. And I think the broader question here, that the reason this got so much, I think, attention in Washington in part, was China's role in this, and especially anything related to China in this town, and suddenly just brings it to the top of the agenda. And I think at the end of the day, the Chinese role was fairly modest in terms of bringing together two parties that had, essentially decided they wanted to do this. And I don't think the Chinese will play much of a role as a guarantor of this. I think they've shown that they have kind of little interest in getting involved in trying to enforce deals like this, although they have the leverage to do so. And let me just make one final kind of broader point, and that's, I think, a fairly concerning trend for U.S. policy looking over the past year is that Iran, in a lot of ways, is less isolated than it was a year ago. That it's mending fences in the region, it's expanding its relationship with Russia and China. The Israel, for its part, is entirely consumed domestically and is kind of unable to mount much of a diplomatic or otherwise offensive against Iran. The Europeans continue to be focused on JCPOA, and the U.S. is largely distracted and focused on de-escalating, but not much more. So I think the Saudi deal is one of these data points to show that in this regard, externally, the Iranians aren't doing too badly compared to a year ago.
Great, fantastic. Thank you for answering all those questions and adding one, an answer to one. So, and which gives us a really nice segue to Suzanne, who earlier this year in Foreign Affairs magazine, if you missed it, as well as a few days ago in testimony to the House Foreign Affairs Committee, has argued for a new approach on Iran. She said that she would like to see an approach that ensures international constraints on and visibility into Iran's nuclear activities, deters Tehran from advancing its most provocative nuclear and regional ambitions, and preserves space for the Iranian people who have and are fighting for democracy to bring about lasting change. She has also said that the most significant achievement in the long-term effort to forestall Iran's nuclear progress was the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, as you know, the JCPOA, and that the Trump administration's unilateral exit has led to the systematic acceleration of Iranian nuclear activities in violation of its JCPOA obligations. However, there has been engaged restraint as of late, if I read you correctly, per recent IAEA reports regarding deceleration of uranium enrichment. Because Iranian Americans currently and now vehemently are generally opposed to a revival of the JCPOA, and there is concern that human rights obligations are being dismissed in lieu of the JCPOA, would you walk us through why you encourage the Biden administration to adopt a new policy and what it might look like, and whether or not it engages human rights as well as the broader security and proliferation concerns?
Thanks, Netta, and my two fellow panelists here are going to be a very tough act to follow in terms of just being incredibly thoughtful and comprehensive and articulate. I'll do my best to try to answer. These are big, meaty questions. One of the reasons I'm calling for a new approach to Iran is because I don't know what our current approach to Iran might be. I do know the Biden administration came into office prioritizing broader issues well beyond the Middle East, but with respect to its Middle East policy, was, I think, in a very determined way seeking to reinstate the JCPOA. I think it was a perfectly reasonable approach for an administration that was trying to repair the damage to America's standing in the world as a result of some of the actions taken by its predecessor and some of the actions that happened in the interlude between the election and the inauguration. But it became clear early on that the Iranians, while they were prepared to engage, they weren't prepared to engage in a way that was going to lead us to a resuscitation of the nuclear deal in a reasonable time frame and with the kind of ambitious objectives that the Biden administration set out. Remember, of course, that when Secretary of State Antony Blinken testified in his confirmation hearings, he called for a better deal, a longer and stronger deal, actually echoing the criticism of many of the critics of the negotiations in the deal itself. Very quickly, it became clear a longer and stronger deal wasn't going to happen. And then over time, it became clear even to President Biden himself, who said this was caught in a hot mic, I think, late last year, saying the nuclear deal is dead. And yet that remained the declared policy of the United States. Our focus in our outward-facing diplomacy, and to a large extent, I think, in the private diplomacy that we were engaged in over the course of throughout 2022 and well into 2023, despite the fact that there was this incredible uprising underway in Iran, that we remained focused on trying to find some way to bring the Iranians back into compliance with their obligations under the deal. I fully understand and appreciate that. It makes sense that any constraint is better than no constraint whatsoever. Any verification and monitoring is better than what was becoming a creeping pattern of non-compliance with the International Atomic Energy Agency by the Iranians. And so I think the Biden administration was trying to make the best of a bad set of circumstances. But of course, the circumstances got a lot worse while they were engaged in trying to resuscitate the deal. The first sort of precipitant that I would point to that really changed the conditions and made it impossible to get back to the JCPOA was the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It just shattered what had been a really hard-fought consensus among the P5, among the three European states plus the Russians and the Chinese that were America's partners, beginning from actually the Bush administration onward, with Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. That was when this P5+1 negotiating framework was established, and that had always been the negotiating framework, and it had held even through some of the other strenuous points of tension between the United States and Russia. It did not hold through Russia's invasion of Ukraine, because that was a cataclysmic event that has upended the regional and the global order in many respects. And so our ability to bring Russia to the table, Russia was in many ways a constructive actor through much of the diplomacy that led to the JCPOA and even afterward with respect to its implementation. Russia could no longer be a constructive actor. And because of the increasing tensions between the United States and China, China was no longer a constructive actor. It had largely been a sort of fellow traveler in the nuclear diplomacy. It wasn't a significant actor in and of its own right, but in the absence of U.S. presence in the deal, the Chinese became one of the most important players in the compliance on the part of the Iranians, because they were the ones who've been importing now record levels of Iranian oil in violation of U.S. sanctions. So that is one set of factors. The other set of factors, which Jasmine spoke about incredibly eloquently, was the sea change within Iran itself. And obviously, Iran has been an authoritarian state since the inauguration of the Islamic Republic. There have been recurrent periods of very significant protest. But what we saw last fall and what we continue to see on the ground today, I think, was something dramatically different, with much more long-standing and wide-ranging implications for the future stability of the Islamic Republic. And my own estimation is that when we are able to tell the story of how this regime fell to a more democratic regime, we will point back to the events of September of 2023 as the most significant period of September 2022. Sorry,
well, the month isn't over yet.
As the beginning of the end. So, as a result of the change within Iran, it was not a regime, given what was happening on the ground, that was prepared to negotiate. As a result of the changes within the inner global order, I think it's sort of unreasonable to anticipate that we can bring back a JCPOA. So what should we be doing? We should work with our allies and partners to try to ensure that we're actually able to sustain some components of the nuclear deal that have been to our advantage. Constraints on Iran's nuclear program, regular routine presence of the IAEA and additional offsite verification mechanisms, and that we're able to do more to deter Iran's troublemaking around the region. There have been, I think it was in our hearing last week that one of our fellow audience members testified at, I think 82 occurrences of Iranian missile and drone strikes on American interests or partners in the region since the Biden administration came into office. And I think there's been a total of 2 or 3 responses, kinetic responses from the United States. That obviously isn't sending the message that is necessary in order to deter the Iranians. We have to be doing more there. We have to be doing more in the Persian Gulf. We're seeing some of this happen quietly, but it needs to be sustained and it needs to be named, because to the extent that we're sending a message to Iran, it needs to be visible and it needs to be verbal. We need to be doing much more with respect to supporting the kind of activism of Iranians on the ground. Because this is ultimately what's going to address the fundamental concerns that we've had about Iranian policy since 1979. That change is coming. We are not positioned in any way, shape, or form for it, because we really just haven't thought through what a world looks like with a different kind of a leadership in Tehran. I'm going to stop there, but I realize I didn't do as good a job as my colleagues did, so we'll come back, I'm sure, to all these questions.
We definitely will, but thank you so much for that, and I really appreciate the notion of sustained and named, and to the extent I think we all are in agreement on that. We're going to go back to Jasmine for a next set of questions in relation to the status of prisoners and important to the larger population, and kind of what Suzanne was talking about the future and moving forward and future protests. What legal changes or challenges have occurred over the past year? Why are these changes and challenges to civil rights and human rights in Iran important? And if you could tell us about them and what, in relation to U.S. policy, what can the United States be doing? What policy recommendations do you have in relation to these legal changes and human rights violations?
Right. So 1 year after Mahsa Amini was killed, not one Iranian official or even low-level person has been held accountable. There was no independent investigation, even though her death sparked months of anti-state protests. Instead, the Iranian parliament is secretly, because it's so afraid of its population, pushing through a bill that would impose further punishments on women that are unveiled in the street. Currently, you can be imprisoned, you can be fined, they can take you to so-called anti-vice courses to educate you if you're accused of not wearing a hijab in the streets. Now they want to block access to your bank accounts. They want to impound your car, on top of those other punishments, by the way. And because the tide is so strong against the government, remember that we saw high school girls participating in these protests. Before, it was always university students. Now we're seeing it in cities all over the country, all the way down to high school. Even some elementary kids were protesting against the state, and high school girls were appearing unveiled. Because the tide is so strong and forever changed in Iran, the government can't enforce these policies by itself. So what it's trying to do is punish people that don't help it. Businesses can lose their licenses and be shut down if they allow women, for example, to be in the premise unveiled. They're trying to get people to police each other, and this increases the possibility of more grave violence and rights violations against women and girls simply because they're endorsing vigilantism. What was the other point that you had asked?
So the legal changes and challenges.
So that's happening. There's also human rights lawyers are a crucial lifeline inside Iran. If you're a dissident, an activist, a young person that went on the street one day for protest and was imprisoned, that lawyer is really your last lifeline to try to navigate the unfair and corrupt court system that really just collaborates with the security agencies. They are also being punished. They are being sacked from their jobs. They're not being allowed to work. The Iranian government is going as far as trying to force the Iranian Bar Association to continue its policies so that it has no independence in the country. That's what's happening legally. At the same time, the people are continuing to stand up. I talked to you guys about the high school girls, and this goes back to Suzanne's point. Iran is a very young country. These girls and the young men that stood beside them, they will outlive and outlast the old men that rule and oppress Iranians through force. And it is true that the policy of the Biden administration is so centered and focused on the nuclear deal only. The fact that Iran can erupt at any moment, it's a powder keg because the people's demands are so unmet. It would be caught flat-footed. So it would be really we hope very much so that you on Congress, for example, can work to amplify the voices of Iranian civil society above the voices of Iranian officials who take up all the airtime whenever there is an event internationally. And I just want to point you all to, there's an op-ed in the New York Times, this is truly significant, by a woman named Nargis Mohammadi. Please look it up. She talks about what happens inside the prisons. She is currently herself inside the prison, and who knows what's happening to her at this moment for writing this op-ed. Pick it up, take out points from there, amplify her voice and other voices of Iranians who take grave risks on the ground above the voices of Iranian officials.
Thank you so much for pointing out that article, as well as referring to the forced hijab bill, the lack of due process, and codifying gender apartheid. Henry, so this time we are going to talk about the hostage deal. The U.S. and Iran finalized a prisoner swap involving the release of 5 Americans held on spurious grounds in Tehran. We've all heard from Congressman Himes about his constituent and PAAIA friend, as well as the released 5 Iranian nationals charged with sanctions violations and other federal crimes. If you would tell us more about the deal, the amount of monies involved, the details of how and when Tehran can access that money, because that's one of the most contentious components, and under what conditions. and whether or not that involves U.S. intelligence and Treasury. And to that point, what the oversight will possibly look like. And then your thoughts on whether, if and how this deal might inhibit hostage taking by other states and non-state actors.
Okay, excellent. Right, I mean, this has become such a political football already. I think it's worth giving a little bit of the details of the swap. So essentially, right, so 5 Americans released, Morad Tabaz, Ahmad Shargi, Siamak Namazi, plus 2 additional who wanted to remain anonymous, one who had been detained during the hostage negotiations, and one who had been in custody for many years prior. In exchange, and as well as 2 of their family members were released as well, so 7. The 2 family members were allowed to leave the country. They weren't actually part of the detained group, in exchange for 5 Iranians for sanctions violation cases, and 1 who is an agent of influence, essentially. 3 of those Iranians are not going home, so 2 of the 5 are back in Iran now. 3 decided not to go. And the most controversial part of this, of course, is the $6 billion transfer of funds. So just a brief background of this. Basically, during the Obama-era sanctions and the part of the Trump-era sanctions period, Iran was allowed to export energy products, primarily oil, and to South Korea is mostly condensate, a light liquid hydrocarbon, which accumulated in South Korean bank accounts that was supposed to be accessible for humanitarian trade. In practice, it was not. And so the South Koreans had this money sitting there. It was actually about $7 billion initially that the Iranians had been trying to get their hands on for quite a long time. And the negotiations had been going on both as part of the JCPOA revival talks that Suzanne talked about, as well as separately over both the hostages and this money, and those issues became essentially linked. And what ended up happening as a result of this deal is that the money, which is now $6 billion due to fluctuations in the Korean currency, as well as the Iranians access some of that money to pay their UN dues. So now $6 billion was moved to Qatari banks, and that money will be accessible to Iran for conducting humanitarian trade. So essentially, countries that want to export humanitarian goods into Iran can be paid through these accounts that are held in Qatar. The administration has not given a lot of detail about how it will exercise oversight, although it has said that it will exercise oversight of the use of this money, and that the money should be accessible now. Essentially, the money's been transferred, and it's scheduled to be accessible to Iran for these permitted purposes. I think there are, and it's already been coming out in congressional statements, a number of concerns about this arrangement. So there are concerns about that Iran will find ways to abuse this channel, and I think on this point, well, there are a number of different ways they could try to abuse it. Some of which the U.S. can do things about, and some of which it's much harder to. I think any humanitarian channel is not going to be airtight. The only way to have a kind of airtight humanitarian channel is to not to have one at all, essentially. So I think there's always some expectation of risk involved, and there's always the potential that a perfectly legal transaction ends up in Iran, and that the IRGC use that to export elsewhere or sell at a very high markup domestically in order to fund their own operations. So that I think is a risk kind of inherent in a transaction like this. I think another aspect of it to keep in mind is that this $6 billion is now money that Iran does not need to spend for its humanitarian imports, and that is money that can be allocated for other purposes. The money is fungible, and again, another kind of fundamental inherent part of an arrangement like this. There's not much that can be done about that, although it is worth noting. I think it's quite an exaggeration to say that $6 billion will immediately hit the accounts of military entities. The Iranian government has a lot of domestic requirements and uses for this money as well, and the defense establishment and the nuclear enterprise have been quite well funded over the past few years, regardless, in part due to the increased oil exports to China. And I think the final point, and the one that really involves Congress and is the most important policy question here, is the precedential one, and how what a deal like this does, and for establishing or kind of showing that the U.S. is willing to, in a roundabout way, trade money for hostages, and the kind of message that sends to Iran and countries like Russia and China that practice state-sponsored hostage taking. I hope we have time for maybe a more in-depth discussion of this later. Because I think there are things that the administration and that Congress can do, both from in terms of deterring hostage taking point of view, and also from deterring travel to Iran. Because I think we should have every expectation that the Iranians will take additional. There are, I believe, tens of thousands of Americans in Iran that are all kind of have targets on their back. One final point just to make about how this fits in with the nuclear issue. And I think the administration had viewed getting this hostage deal done as a key step forward for resuming nuclear negotiations with Iran. And I think there should be every expectation that nuclear talks of some kind will resume this fall. Not with the aim of getting an agreement, but with the aim of trying to take additional de-escalatory steps and try to keep things under wraps for the next year plus. So it is linked in that sense that this was the kind of prerequisite that the administration set in order to try to advance on those types of nuclear-related negotiations. So the nuclear aspect of this, which had been kind of dormant for quite a while, at least from a diplomatic front, it will be set to emerge in the headlines pretty soon.
And speaking of that, I'm going to ask Suzanne about that in a moment. She is, I think, going to hop onto this question and answer a little bit. So thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to just say another word or two about the hostage agreement, because obviously with the return today of 5 Americans of Iranian descent who've been held unjustly for, in some cases, as long as 8 years. This is big news, and it's directly relevant to, I'm sure, what you're all thinking about and working on. The first thing, there's something very positive to say about what the administration did with this deal, in the sense that they went in with eyes wide open. Murad Tahbaz, for example, had been included in a prior arrangement. He was released on bail at the same time that the UK negotiated a different hostage deal, the release of a woman who'd been held for years after visiting her family in Iran. She was traveling at the time with her 2-year-old daughter. Her daughter, I think now, is 8 or 9. She was held for years unjustly, and she was released. And Murad Tahbaz was part of that arrangement. He was released on bail only, and 24 to 48 hours later, the Iranians put him back in prison in explicit violation of what they had agreed to with the British. And there was a lot of frustration and anger about the way that was done. And I think the way that the administration essentially sequenced this so that the Iranians did not have access to any funds until and unless the Americans actually left Iranian airspace was important to ensuring that the Iranians held up to their end of the bargain. And you'll hear me a little bit more on this when we get to the potential for nuclear diplomacy, because I think that kind of assurance mechanism, accountability that the Iranians are actually going to deliver on any commitments they might make, is essential to any effective and successful diplomacy with the Islamic Republic. This is not a regime that can be trusted. And so any kind of diplomatic arrangement has to build in that kind of redundancy. I would also suggest that the sort of agreement that the Iranians made with respect to this hostage trade really does point to the underlying weakness and insecurity of the regime today. The fact that they were willing to agree to at least the public statement that this is the funds can only be used for humanitarian purposes. Of course, the Iranian president has disavowed that in some of his own public statements. But really, this is an Iranian regime of 10 or 15 years ago would not have in any way subjected itself to conditions that mimic, at least, sort of generally, the kind of oil for food arrangements that Saddam Hussein's regime was put under. So I think what it tells you is this is a regime that is very, very eager to get access to capital abroad. And that brings me to the final point just on this the piece of the hostage diplomacy, which is there is now a $1 billion price on the head of every foreign national who enters Iran, especially any Westerner. Don't discount how valuable this is to Iranians, and don't discount the fact that people still do travel. It's primarily Iranian Americans and Iranian nationals from other countries, and they often do travel on their own passports, on their Iranian passports, which makes it very difficult to try to prevent further travel. But I can tell you, even in my own Montgomery County neighborhood, there are people who've gone on tours recently, not of Iranian descent. I travel around the country, I talk about Iran, and you'd be surprised at the number of Americans who think that this is kind of a nifty place to travel to. Now, I know it is. I was part of the first, I think, only two academic exchanges that took place between the United States government and the Iranian government in the late 1990s. Iran is a phenomenal place. Iranians are phenomenal people. But this is a government that is very, very dangerous, and it will use any person it can get its hands on. The people who were released today did absolutely nothing wrong. They are held because they were targets of opportunity for someone within the system to get some kind of benefit, and ultimately the regime used them to get significant economic benefits. And we really need to make sure that we insulate ourselves, our own government, but also that all of our partners in Europe and especially Japan, South Korea, where there's business travel, there's tourist travel. We need to be taking more actions because it's obvious that this government will simply do it again. This has been a feature of Iranian policymaking since 1979.
Thank you so much, Suzanne, for in reiterating the importance of redundancies in deals and as well as the need for further and strengthened engagement. I do want to ask you about a different deal. October marks the expiration of UN prohibitions on Iranian ballistic missile activities, as well as European sanctions against Iran's nuclear, missile, and military trusts, if you would. And so while the EU and UK are reportedly expected to defend most of their non-proliferation sanctions on Iran, UN penalties are expected to sunset, thereby rendering Tehran politically unconstrained when it comes to the ballistic missile testing and transfers. Would you agree to that? And do you think this will occur? And your thoughts on what's being done to prevent these sunsets? And your thoughts also on the likely outcome if the sunset occurs, but the EU and UK retain their sanctions?
I know Henry has a lot to say on this, so I'll try to be more brief this time. But and this is an issue where we probably have slightly different views. I do trust that the EU, the individual European states, and the UK will retain the better part of the sanctions regime, which will continue to apply penalties to Iran for some of the actions that will no longer be under UN sanctions. I personally feel that we should have sought much more vigorously to invoke the snapback mechanism, and I hear we may disagree. But the snapback mechanism was a way for any party to the deal to effectively ensure that we did not come to this conclusion on October 18th, and that the UN sanctions remained in force. And in fact, all of the nuclear era sanctions would have been reimposed as a result of that. I understand why it has been a subject of some restraint by the Biden administration and by our European allies, that fundamentally there is a desire to keep at least the kind of structure of the JCPOA still in place in hopes that somehow we can navigate back to a place where serious nuclear diplomacy is possible. I think there's also a deep concern that essentially self-deters us, that there is a fear that any step we take, which is perceived by the Iranians as significantly raising the threshold, changing the nature of the current standoff, that they themselves will respond by taking a dramatic step, such as leaving the non-proliferation treaty or kicking out the IAEA inspectors entirely, or taking some other step that would essentially move us to a different and more urgent and more dangerous place with respect to the nuclear standoff. I fully appreciate and respect that interpretation. I worry, though, that we have left in place the fragments of a diplomatic arrangement which is no longer functional, which the Iranians can violate at any moment, and we will never get back to a place, given the current geopolitics with Russia and China, where we will ever be able to impose UN Security Council sanctions of the nature that had been imposed previously on Iran. And so I would have sought to return us to that state, recognizing that there were some risks attached to it. But I think Henry can probably make a better argument as to why it landed where it did.
Yeah, I can explain why it landed where it did. And I think I would just I would say that I agree with Suzanne's construction if we fast forward it 2 years and say, I think, so the snapback mechanism expires in 2025, October 2025. And I think that, at least in the views of a lot of European policymakers, is the actual, there needs to be a deal in place by then. Otherwise, we have to pull the ripcord on this for precisely the reason that Suzanne outlined, which is because you're never going to get another Security Council resolution on Iran in our lifetimes, probably. And so you want to be able to use that mechanism if you need to before it expires. I think that the reason that we're not looking at snapback now is that, I think the U.S. and the E3 primarily are deterred by what the Iranians have said that they would do if they were to invoke that. And I think the view in European capitals, who would be the ones that would have to execute such a maneuver, is that the retaliation from Iran would outweigh the benefits that would be gained by actually triggering snapback. So the threat of snapback being potentially more useful than actually invoking it. And it's actually a intellectually interesting mutual deterrence type equation that the Iranians, and this is has been, I think, is crystal clear in European capitals and in Iran, that if the Europeans trigger snapback, then the Iranians will begin enriching to 90% and potentially leave the NPT, and vice versa, that if the Iranians enrich to 90%, then the Europeans will trigger snapback. And I think because that you're in this, that equation has been established, and by the way is years old, this is not a new dynamic, that it's very hard to convince European capitals to try to take a different assessment of that. And so essentially what they've done is try to split the baby here, that decide that if snapback is off the table, but also doing nothing and letting their own national sanctions expire is also unconscionable in the current environment. They're trying to extend some of their own national authorities to try to compensate a bit. But there's no doubt that, come October 19th, the day after, that Iran will be more free to do things internationally. We saw the Russian defense minister is in Tehran today, and I would imagine on the agenda are the types of things that activities that will now be legal in about a month. So I think it is a new environment that will be that we'll be living in, and I think the Iranians will see this as a huge victory, that by even in an environment where they are not complying with the agreement, they still have earned this type of relief, and despite their blatant support of the Russians in Ukraine.
Thank you. My last question for everyone in different ways, and maybe we start with Jasmine on it, is whether or not you think Washington is failing to connect the dots between regional and great power competition between Iran, Russia, and China, and specifically for you, Jasmine, if what you're seeing in terms of online tools, surveillance tools, artificial intelligence tools, and how they impact human rights and the protests that we're seeing. For Henry and Suzanne, your thoughts on this connecting the dots or failing to connect the dots as it relates to economic and military goals between the three countries, and maybe more than those three countries specifically.
Sure. If I could just really quickly address the hostage taking.
Yes.
So Suzanne talked about how there's now $1 billion every foreign national that walks in. There's dollar signs over their heads. What we want to know is when countries are going to take a multilateral approach to this, because right now the Iranians have learned they can negotiate unilaterally with each country, get concessions. And so they have tons of hostages that have been left behind, including a U.S. national under the under the Levinson Act, Jamshid Sharmad, who has a death sentence hanging over his head. So while we welcome the release of these poor hostages who've been held there, there's so many more there. And so I want to just talk about the Declaration Against Arbitrary Detention in State-to-State Relations. This can be found on the Canadian government's website. There's a plan out there that really outlines steps that states can take together to deter this practice, and that's really the starting point. Also, to call it what it is, hostage taking, and allow Iranians to bristle under that. Bring it up all the time. Don't let it just get put under the carpet. Now it's done. There's all these other hostages, including an older Iranian woman, German citizen. She's in her late 60s. Her name is Nahi Taghavi. She is having serious health problems there. So these people can die if we don't get to them soon enough. On the issue of internet surveillance and everything, it's truly sad the way that the Iranian government puts the internet in chains in Iran, like the population, because it's so terrified of the potential of the population to connect with the outside world, publicize evidence of atrocities that occur inside Iran. We have a major report on our website, iranhumanrights.org. We describe what really amount to crimes against humanity that we've sent to the independent fact-finding mission on Iran, which was established in November to address what's happening there on the human rights level. The internet situation is getting worse. Iran is trying to unveil something it calls the National Information Network that really cuts all the population off from access to the World Wide Web and only allows them to access content that the Iranian government thinks is appropriate. So on our side, what we can do is the administration took a good step forward by putting forward General License D2. But there really hasn't been any movement by the tech companies on enabling access to the tools and services, the personal communications tools that would really help Iranians on the streets, the ones that risk their lives at protests and to organize. And I don't know why it is that these major companies, Google, Amazon, continue to follow the old framework. So perhaps letters of comfort, direct letters of comfort to these companies, encouraging them to allow Iranians to access their services would be useful. Also, targeted sanctions on the human rights violators in Iran, some of whom travel freely to European countries and put their kids in schools there. Why are these people allowed to do this? The United States, of course, doesn't allow that to happen. It can push for other governments to do that, congressional delegations, also on the international level.
Thank you. And then Henry and Suzanne, your thoughts on Washington's policy on connecting between regional and great power competition as it relates to Iran, China, and Russia, and potentially other countries in coming to terms on economic and military goals?
Sure, I can start, and then Suzanne can fill in all of the places where I've missed or messed up. I think just to tie it back to the what I mentioned in the very beginning about the Saudi-Iran deal providing the Iranian leadership alternatives to dealing with the West. I think this is a really key dynamic here, and if we're talking about the potential for ways to de-escalate on the nuclear file, you want to try to ensure that Iran living without some kind of deal is intolerable as an incentive to try to persuade the leadership to accept some type of agreement. And we can debate what type of agreement that should be. Should it be JCPOA? Should it be something bigger, smaller, et cetera? But I'm of the view that the diplomatic pathway still should be at the forefront of our policy, but it becomes very hard to try to advance that when Iran's life, absent an agreement, has some bright spots, and I think that's where the Russia and China relationship really ties in. I think in large part the Chinese hold the keys to the Iranian economy. Suzanne mentioned China is basically the only real buyer of Iranian oil, 90+%. It's also a huge source of Iran's non-oil trade. The Chinese have a tremendous amount of leverage here that they've chosen not to use, but I think what they've been willing to do in terms of defying U.S. sanctions has really been a lifeline for Iran to be able to kind of muddle through over time. And I think their relationship with Russia as well, much more military, less economic, although there's some movement on the economic front, is an opportunity for Iran to play on the world stage, to market its drone exports around the world, to be a country that's able to stick their finger in the eyes of NATO and fight on European soil. And I think at the end of the day, not pay a huge price for it. European governments, despite, I hear again and again that the Iranian involvement in the Ukraine war changes everything, but the focus is still very much on, we're pushing for a return to nuclear diplomacy. I don't disagree with that necessarily, but I think the idea is that Iran has not paid a significant price for this, and I think it's important to note that as recently as the end of August of last year, the U.S. was willing to do a nuclear agreement with Iran, even though it was public knowledge that Iran was supplying weaponry to Russia and had started using that weaponry in the context of the Ukraine conflict. So I think these the Russia and China dimension here are really important to understanding why the Iranians may be quite cautious and coy about doing any types of diplomacy, because they offer them a way out.
I can't add very much to both Henry and Jasmine's remarks, but I would just make 2 points. One is that it is astounding that a year after the most dramatic and I think most widely recognized public demonstrations in Iran that were sympathized with around the world in a much more direct way than I think any prior period of unrest in Iran has evoked. Iran now has more diplomatic access, not less diplomatic access. It's acceded to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. It's joined the BRICS. It has now, sort of this ongoing rapprochement with the closest U.S. security partners, save Israel, in the Middle East. And so it has far more room for maneuver, despite the fact that, it has been a year of epic repression at home, and continued malfeasance around the region and continued expansion of its nuclear activities. The second point that I would make is that what we see in what Henry just described is the sort of alignment of cooperation and convenience among these three parties, that China helps the Iranian economy stay afloat, that Iran in turn helps the Russian military get access to precision technology, and not just to give them imports of Iranian drones, but in fact to help them build the factories and train the users of those drones so that they can improve upon Iran's technology and really amplify their own war effort in Ukraine. And once again, that is a very powerful set of relationships for all three actors. And to the extent that U.S. policy now rightfully is much more heavily focused on strategic competition with Russia and China, we have to understand that Iran is very much a core part of that axis. It's not an axis of evil. It is an alignment of cooperation among authoritarian states that are doing very dangerous and disruptive things around the world. And we can't actually prevail in this kind of competition with China unless we're prepared to take more strenuous action vis-a-vis Iran, and the same is true with respect to Russia.
Thank you so much for that thorough answer and connecting those dots. We have a few minutes, so if there's like one or two questions for our great panelists that I didn't get to, yes.
Thank you for being here. Your overview was excellent. I would just like to ask the panel overall, how do you think we can incentivize Iran to come back to negotiations when we know that all of these actors that you also talked about now, China as well as Russia back in the day when JCPOA was set up, they've also played a key role in it. So now that they don't want to anymore, China trying to dismantle the order that we set up. So with whom do we ally and partner up with in order to get Iran back to the table? And how do we do any of that when China is not on our side?
And we're out of time.
I'm going to start very briefly and then hand it over to Henry and Jasmine. But I think when the Obama administration sought to impose the most strenuous sanctions on Iran, including targeting Iran's oil sector, obviously with a lot of help from Congress in terms of going in that direction. Many people, including me, said it couldn't be done, we couldn't actually knock Iran's oil production out of the market without having catastrophic global consequences. It was done. It didn't have catastrophic global consequences, and it brought Iran to the negotiating table in a way that had not been the case ever before. You can argue about whether we got what we needed out of the JCPOA. I'll set that aside. Those sanctions worked. We have not been enforcing our sanctions. The conditions aren't great for that enforcement, given the fact that we're also trying to apply sanctions to Russia. But this is a time where we actually have to be prepared to pay some price and to take some risks. And we will not be able to bring the same P5+1 back. That's not going to be the negotiating framework. And that's one of the many reasons why I think we can't go back to anything that looks like the JCPOA. But we can bring together world powers. I mean, you look at what we've been able to do vis-a-vis China in terms of new alignments across the Asia-Pacific and the Indo-Pacific. It's been incredible, but it takes American leadership and it takes a determined strategy. The Biden administration is seeking to keep Iran on the back burner so that it doesn't distract it, but it is actually core to the main challenges that we're facing.
Or I can go.
Can I just say something really quick? Much less than I understand, nuclear nonproliferation is extremely important. I would like to see the U.S. government and governments around the world help to work to hold Iranian officials accountable for their crimes against humanity on the principle of universal jurisdiction. I just want to point out the country is being led by two guys. One of them, the president, is in New York right now. He's accused of crimes against humanity. He was a young prosecutor in the 1980s when thousands of Iranian political prisoners were hanged after being subjected to Inquisition-like trials by a death commission that this president sat on. So in addition to pursuing nuclear nonproliferation, can we please also put the focus on holding these guys accountable through the principle of universal jurisdiction?
And I think just a few points to add. I mean, I think just to underscore what Suzanne said, I think the idea is you want to make there's the concept in negotiation theory, the BATNA, the best alternative to a negotiated agreement, and you want to make that alternative for Iran worse than the status quo. And there are a number of ways you can do that. Enforcing the oil sanctions is a really key one. And I think drawing in, I think Suzanne mentioned this is exactly right, drawing in other players here to try to both increase the cost to Iran of continuing where it is today and also increasing the benefits if it were over time to comply with an agreement. So that's regional countries, that's countries like India, which is playing an increasingly important global role and also has long-standing ties with Iran, although quite good compliance with our sanctions. And I think I think for a lot of, just to tie it back earlier, countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, that are charting their own kind of paths with Iran are doing so in part because they don't see a clear policy direction from Washington. And so I think there is something to be said for what kind of a clear approach from the U.S. and how that can start to change the risk calculations of countries in the region that I think made a lot of their kind of strategic calculations back in 2019 when they welcomed, I think, the Trump administration's maximum pressure policy, but very quickly realized that did not come with the same assurances that perhaps they had imagined. And you can see the fruits of that with Iran's relationship now with the UAE and Saudi Arabia. So I think countries in the in the region and broader can see what these dynamics, that Iran is not being treated as a top priority, that it's not being kind of viewed within the same context as the challenge coming from China, and I think are going their own way. So, but I don't think we should underestimate the implications of if we were to actually put prioritization on this, how other countries might be more responsive to our approaches.
Please join me in thanking and welcoming our esteemed panelists and this comprehensive discussion on Iran internally, regionally, and internationally today in commemoration of Mahsa Amini. Thank you so much.
Thank you.